Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Warhamster Brady, and joining me today is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Glad to be here. Let's go. I'm looking forward to today's episode because, we've been going through these executive orders, but these latest ones are really interesting.
Yeah, there's a couple of big ones that we're going to focus on today, and they're right. They are interesting. So as everyone who's been watching, or if you haven't, we've spent the last few episodes going through Trump's executive orders and asking the question more: is it constitutional? Then is it a good idea? One thing we need to be consistent with our constitutional principles, even if we agree with the intent of something Donald Trump does. We don't want him overstepping the bounds of the office, because that always comes back to haunt you in the long term.
Right.
You ask the question: what happens if someone whose politics you don't agree with has that power? And we've lived under that, under Biden and Obama and Bush, etc. So that's really the whole purpose of this: is let's keep the executive branch in its lane.
Excuse me.
All right. Well, the big one today, we're going to open this one. Since our last episode, we've had some new executive orders, and we got about 2 pages to go through. The one I want to start with today that's dropped just a couple days ago, is a plan for establishing a United States sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah, this has been a big one for you, for sure.
Yeah. It says it's the policy of the United States to maximize the stewardship of our national wealth for the sole benefit of American citizens. To this end, blah, 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 we are going to establish a sovereign wealth fund to promote fiscal sustainability, lessen the burden of taxes on American families, etc. I'm not sure how he's going to do that to start with, but before we go any further, what exactly is a sovereign wealth fund? Historically, it's created from excess. Excess. Shoot, I thought I was sharing my screen. It's excess funds of rich countries. But if you look at where the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world are, I've got a little screenshot of that. You've got the government pension fund of Norway. That's all oil excess. They've got all this offshore oil, and Norway's a very wealthy country, and that's why they can afford to have 100% socialized medicine, open borders, etc. That's starting to backfire. You've got the China Investment Corp. It's a communist country. United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia. So these are not exactly what you would call free market economies whatsoever. The other issue here is the United States is not trading from an excess. How do you have a sovereign wealth fund when we're $36 trillion in debt?
Right.
But going into the executive order itself, talk about the sovereign wealth fund to promote fiscal sustainability. How's he going to do it? The Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce, in close coordination to the President of Economic Policy, shall develop a plan for the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund consistent with Section 1 of this order. Let's go to the general provisions. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect the authority granted by law to an executive department or agency, the functions of the OMB, that's the budget. This order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations, and it is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable law or inequity by any party against the United States, etc. So let's get into the first question. Is this remotely constitutional?
Well, and, for the layman, please explain what he was really meant here by this fund. This is...
Basically,
I'm asking you because this is an area that I'm not real familiar with.
What it does is allows the government to invest in private enterprises, whether it be publicly traded companies, mining rights, et cetera, as an equity partner. I find it problematic in many ways. I think one of our main goals is to keep the government out of our markets. The last thing we want them to do, and there's a reason for that. We want the United States as a nation to be wealthy, but we don't necessarily want our government to be wealthy. But the other problem is that the slippery slope and all the bad incentives.
You're opening the door to mercantilism.
Well, it is mercantilism. Alexander Hamilton would have loved this executive order.
Yeah. So from a constitutional standpoint, there's no authority to give the federal government to be involved in the private market whatsoever. And a free market, a private free market, is one that has little or no government influence on it. Should there be some regulations? An average person would say, well, yeah. From a constitutional standpoint, those would typically come from the states, not the federal government. I don't know if this is necessarily a good idea, because it goes back to the old adage that be careful what powers you give yourself, because the other side's can get those powers later.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you talk about the regulatory. Some industries are state regulated, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'll give you a great example from my background is the insurance industries. You've got 50 different state insurance regulators, and they look a lot alike, but the differences matter sometimes. For example, I cannot get a PPO health insurance here in New Hampshire unless it's through my company. That's problematic when you have to get an HMO. You have to worry about going in-network and out-work. Most states you can get an HMO or a PPO, but the choices are limited because the regulators deemed it so. Now, the other side, insurance is, it's considered investments, but when you talk about securities like stocks and bonds, you're regulated by a national agency like the SEC or SRO, which is self-regulatory organization, which is FINRA. Now they do on a national scale, and they probably work sometimes in conjunction with local law enforcement, but it really is national top-down. And that gets problematic as well because they end up favoring the big players over the small. When it comes down to handing down SEC fines, you find that the smaller broker players get put out of business, and the bigger ones get a slap on the wrist. So there's some give and take to that regulation, and I agree with you that most of these things should be done by the states. And I think we've talked about with regulatory, it makes sense. You can get 50 states together to create a uniform set of rules that are enforced locally, and that's probably the best solution. Here's where it gets problematic. The example that Trump's given has been that, well, maybe it's an opportunity for us to invest in TikTok. Okay, that solves a few issues with the Chinese spying, et cetera, but now you have the government getting the same algorithm. We've already seen the government spy on people and censor on YouTube. How difficult is it going to be for a bad government to censor if they own one of the biggest social media platforms?
And once again, too, depending on who's in office, it could be used as a quote-unquote propaganda machine.
It gets worse than that, though, in the conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. TikTok has competitors. Let's say you get a competitor, call it, let's say Rumble, which is privately owned. And not, well, it's a publicly traded company now, but it's in the private sector, not that the government doesn't have its hand in it. When it comes to government regulations, the government's got every incentive to favor TikTok and over Rumble because they have an equity stake in it. Mm-hmm. That is a big problem. If you do that across industries, let's say the government decides that they're picking winners and losers. What it comes down to, if the government invests, with $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund into, say, one oil company versus another, who's going to get the benefits? Who's going to get the preferential leases? Who's going to get preferential regulation? The conflicts of interest are just everywhere.
Well, and then in that case, too, something like TikTok would get the governmental preference. And so now you're encouraging other businesses to now start lobbying government more to seek out those types of preferences. And so now you've got a greater chance of collusion, and it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it really does. And that includes the revolving door between the regulators and the private sector. We've seen public-private enterprises before, and they always end badly. There's, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is basically electricity, and that's corrupt as all heck. It's just, there are no good outcomes to come from this. And again, we see what happens in Saudi Arabia, where the partially government-owned Aramco gets the advantage with every single lease, everything. I mean, you just cannot compete with them with a national government. It absolutely destroys the free market anywhere they put their finger in the pie. So not only can they not do it, I don't think Congress probably could create one constitutionally. That's within their authority. But even if Congress did that, It's still a terrible idea. I mean, libertarians ought to be freaking out.
Yeah, and this is the first executive order that we've. I think that I'm saying it's outright unconstitutional. The other ones, we had some constitutional leeway, or they were purely constitutional. And the problems with a lot of the others was not whether or not the executive order was constitutional, but whether or not the law it was associated with was constitutional, which is kind of beyond Trump's control in that sense. But this one, yeah, outright unconstitutional. Appreciate the president, but
well, what he's thinking. He's thinking, okay, we're going to, get some kind of a agreement with Greenland so it becomes under U.S. control of some way, shape, or form. And they've got these very difficult to get to mines, so the government's going to make the investment and reap the benefits as everything comes out of the ground. Well, there's a few problems with that. The government is not very good at anything besides killing people and taking our money. Everything else the government does is better left in private hands. They mess up everything. They can't even, they couldn't even get a healthcare website up in time. And it's because it's not because we have stupid people in government. It's because they have all the wrong incentives because they're using other people's money.
Right. And when it comes to Greenland, I mean, unleash the free market, allow the free market do what it does. Economically, we benefit. That's government's hand is making sure that because the president doesn't have any direct influence on the economy as much as people think, but he does have indirect influences on the economy, such as pulling back regulations, things like that.
So just to emphasize the point, we've got a really good example of what happens when governments run investment funds. You get all kinds of malinvestment. One of the biggest pension funds in the world is CalPERS in California. And that's the public, CalPERS and CalSTRS. One's for teachers, one's for public employees. It's a big investment fund. It funds their pensions. It's got, I don't know, it's up to billions or trillions of dollars, but their performance is awful. They basically have a board that decides where the investment's going to go. And what they're really doing is they're picking asset managers, or portfolio managers, similar to what I used to do for a living. Well, there's no way in heck I'm ever going to get any money from CalPERS or CalSTRS to manage, even though if I have a great track record, because I don't have the political connections. This is crony capitalism. It is given out to people that basically have those political connections. And in return, if you're a big asset manager and you're getting named to manage billions of dollars for California, you're also expected somehow to contribute to the campaigns of the politician who put you in power. In this case, Gavin Newsom. It gets worse than that with CalPERS and CalSTRS because they decide now it's political with their investment decisions. And they decide they're going to invest in a bunch of these green initiatives. Well, as we've seen in the case of things like Splendor, that doesn't work out too well. So as an investment manager, you have a fiduciary responsibility to get the best return for your clients, and that's it. You cannot have political considerations. There are green funds and stuff like that. If that's what a customer wants you to invest in green, that's one thing. But for you to, if your job is just total return, which it should be with a pension fund, that's a fiduciary job. That's the fiduciary's job. And you're having political considerations into what you're going to invest in. You're going to see things like what's going to happen in our lifetime is CalPERS and CalSTRS is not going to be able to meet their benefits. And the CalPERS and CalSTRS are going to need a huge federal bailout. And the rest of us are going to pay for that.
Yeah.
So that's to show you really the slippery slope. You cannot have a political connection to investment. Anything else you want to say on that one, or do we hammer that one home?
No, we're good.
Yeah, it's an absolute, it's the transactional nature of Trump. And I get where he's going with it. He wants America to be strong and rich, and he wants us to be able to compete with these other sovereign wealth funds. But it's just a really misguided idea. And it shows you that, MAGA or Trump's version of it is not always going to be constitutional. And that's why I've always said he is the right guy for right now, because sometimes you need a hammer to take out some nails. Mm-hmm. But when, the era of Trump is over, I'm looking for someone who's going to be a lot more small government constitutional than we have today. And again, I voted for Trump gladly, knowing this is who he was. Okay, next executive order. And I know, by the way, before we close out of that one, a lot of people were celebrating the announcement yesterday, and I got into some heated battles on social media. and because I normally don't criticize Trump all that much. In this case. All right. So we're going to go forward in time, starting with the most recent one. This is withdrawing the United States from ending funding to certain United Nations organizations and reviewing United States support to all international organizations. It's talking about the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, this United Nations Human Rights Council has always gotten a lot of grief because some of the countries with the worst human rights records in the world sit on that.
Right.
I looked it up yesterday, and they sit for 3-year terms, and a new term of the Human Rights Council for 2025 just was seated in January, and it's actually an improvement from what it was a few years ago. The really outliers were, I think, was Congo, which we're having a civil war right now with, basically genocides going on. Not exactly a human rights bastion of it. I'm going to blow this up. I can see it's not quite big enough. He says 3 UN organizations that deserve renewed scrutiny are the UN Human Rights Council, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organizations, UNESCO, and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees Near East, UNRWA. These organizations have been rife with corruption for a very long time. Trump is saying the U.S. will not participate in these, nor will seek election to that body. The Secretary shall terminate office of the United States reps, blah, blah, blah. Same thing with UNESCO. Question, Doug. Is this a constitutional executive order?
It depends on whether or not we are members of these organizations due to a treaty. If we are a member of this organization based on a treaty, then a new treaty has to supersede that treaty and then be ratified by the Senate. Or a Congress with the president has to decide that we need to exit the treaty. If it's based on an agreement, which I'm not a fan of that type of language, then yeah, he could do that. Here's the thing about the United Nations, UNESCO, all these sub-organizations. In the Virginia Ratifying Convention, there was a deep discussion about international polities. And the fear was that being a part of these treaty organizations would endanger American sovereignty. And the idea was that it would be a danger that any international polity might try to supersede the Constitution, might try to dictate to the country what it can and can't do, regardless of our Constitution. And that was the real fear. So while the constitutionality really depends on whether or not there's a treaty attached to it, the very fact that we're members of these polities in the first place was something that the Founding Fathers warned against.
Yeah, when it comes to the United Nations itself, we can withdraw anytime we want.
And I'm of the firm opinion that we should withdraw, and if we do, and that remains in place for a long enough time, that whole organization collapses.
Yeah, well, because the United States funds 22% of it overall, and 28% of a lot of these organizations.
Right.
Like these 3 organizations he's withdrawing from here, they're gone without the U.S. participation.
Right.
What also happens is an awful lot of NGOs that rely on the funding from them disappear very quickly. That's why Bill Gates is up in arms over this USAID and these right here, because his tax-free foundation has been making a fortune from the government teeth. To withdraw from funding these organizations, I believe it's within his power. The bigger question is, can you withdraw altogether from the United Nations? I looked it up.
And you're right. The funding he can withdraw, but for us to withdraw to get completely, I believe there's a congressional
it does
component there.
And to that note, Ron Paul, a few years back, actually proposed the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. and a few others looking to terminate U.S. membership in the UN.
Yeah.
Now, putting on, I wouldn't call it conspiracy hat, but the bottom line is the United Nations was basically architected by the Rockefellers and friends. One Rockefeller Plaza is where the United Nations is. This has always been a marketplace of greed and corruption on an international scale. These diplomats, and I use that with air quotes, from other countries always come there with our hands out to see how many handouts can I take home to my home country from the UN, and it's almost always at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a good idea. I think it's within his constitutional rights to cease funding, at least upon further review, just like with the USAID.
Right.
Let's audit where that money is going from,
or any federal expenditures. That includes the federal funding for grants and loans, which the courts said, no, you can't do that, and I'm a firm believer you can. The interesting thing, and really thing to think about here too, is if we withdraw our funding, if we remove ourselves, and the whole organization collapses, is it in our best interest to get back into some type of agreement with other countries in a similar manner of seeking global cooperation? And I would say no. Let countries independently make their deals with other countries and leave it at that.
And if you really keep track of those organizations like UNESCO, a lot of them, they deal with refugee resettlement and all that kind of stuff. Foreign aid gets siphoned off into private hands, doesn't always get where it's supposed to be. These agencies from the United Nations have been incredibly ineffective at their stated purpose, and they really don't deserve funding, at least upon some serious federal review. Okay. We ought to go back and read that Ron Paul bill one of these days. I'm sure it's an absolute piece of art.
Yeah, and here's the thing about Ron Paul, and let me say this the best I can. I am not the kind of Ron Paul fan that Ron Paul fans are. People who supported Ron Paul were quite enthusiastic about their support of Ron Paul. That said, I think Doge needs Ron Paul. Just saying.
I voted for Ron Paul 3 times, and he only ran twice. So that's how I feel. Yeah, I am an old school Ron Paul libertarian.
Okay.
Without a doubt. He was probably one of my earliest political influences.
Definitely a constitutional guy and understands it better than probably just about anybody else that was in government at the time. And I am a fan of his son, Rand.
There's a great clip from Jon Stewart back when he used to be funny. I think it was the 2016.
When he used to be funny. I'm sorry, that was so good.
Back in 2012, during the primaries in Iowa, he finished second, just a few points behind whoever was in first. And every single media outlet, both on the left and the right, were talking about who finished first, third, fourth, and fifth. And Stewart's whole shtick was behind who? It's like the guy didn't exist. They wouldn't even talk about him. It was pretty blatant. And I'm glad he's alive to see some of the stuff going on today with some of these executive orders, because it's been pretty consistent for a lot of years. Okay, next executive order. This is a national security presidential memorandum, NSPM2. Basically, it's a memo to...
So understand, presidential memorandums and executive orders are different animals. They, in effect, do the same thing, but executive orders, for lack of a better way of putting it, are a little bit meatier, and they are numbered. Presidential memorandums are not numbered.
This one can be summed up pretty easily. Imposing maximum pressure on the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, denying Iran all paths to a nuclear weapon, and countering Iran's malign influence. Pretty short and to the point.
Yeah.
He's been pretty consistent on that. There's chatter that Iran's trying, going to assassinate him. Iran's been spying on our government, etc. Trump made a statement yesterday? I think he says, if Iran kills me, we have orders to basically decimate the entire country. It's a pretty stern warning. I don't think we need to go into too much detail on this.
No, but it does tie into something else that Trump has recently said, which I'm not sure if I'm hip with yet, is we're going to control Gaza. Since there's so much influence by places like Iran, and since it's such a SH hole, the only way to really get it to where people can live there reasonably is for us to just take it over and fix it. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea.
Well, the other part of that is he's also talked about moving all the Palestinian people into other countries, whether it be Egypt or Jordan or others. Well, okay, that's really interesting because that just basically gave Israel everything they ever wanted for the Greater Israel Project. That's going to be a problem long term. I think that does not promote long-term peace in the Middle East.
Well, Palestinian people are not really a people. They are basically refugees from these other locations. And if you really want to trace them all the way back, they go back to the island of Crete. But, it's a political movement that was created to stand against Israel. Yeah,
and it's very, very challenging for the Israelis and the Palestinian people to ever live in peace. There's an awful lot of history and bad blood.
And that's the ones that are Islamicized. I mean, there are an awful lot of Muslims that live in peace in Israel. They have decided, you know what? We're not going to fight Israel. We're going to live in peace with them, and we're going to prosper because they have a system we can prosper in. The safest Muslims in the world are in Israel.
The problem for Israel faces, of course, is you can't tell one from the other. And the way the radical Islamic terrorists have operated has been basically to infiltrate and commit war against civilians because they cannot do it militarily.
Right.
There's a lot of slippery slopes on this whole issue. Containment of Iran, which executive order is all about, that should be probably a good goal. Not letting Iran have a nuclear weapon, I think we can all agree that's probably a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
How he goes about doing it, is it all sanctions and tariffs? We shall see. But it brings back the question, is that within the President of the United States' purview? Is it constitutional, executive order, or memorandum?
Absolutely.
It's foreign policy.
Yeah, he's commander-in-chief.
It's foreign policy, whether it's good policy or bad policy, is still within the president's rights. That's what he's there to do. Okay, there's these next two are kind of hand in hand. And one is about the southern border and the other is about the northern border. So this is the progress in the situation of the northern border. It's not necessarily an executive order. It's a presidential action. I guess it is called an executive order. I determined the failure of Canada to arrest, seize, and detain and otherwise intercept drug trafficking organizations, blah, blah, blah. To address that threat, I invoked my authority under Section 1702, blah, blah, to impose ad valorem tariffs on articles that are products of Canada.
And it's interesting because the question is, can the president impose tariffs like that? And it's a mixed answer. Tariffs have to be imposed legislatively. It has to begin with a law. But there is legislation in place that basically says, hey, if it's an emergency situation or it's involved with national security, then the president can use tariffs. That's an interesting law that's on the books. Did the Democrats not know it's there? Oh, wait a second. The Biden administration also used tariffs, even though they say they're against them. Now, that said, since this executive order has gone into place, Canada has caved.
And this executive order says pause in recognition of the steps taken by the government of Canada in order to assess whether the threat described in Section 1 of this order has abated. The additional 25% rates of duty and 10% rates of duty to energy products shall be paused and will not take effect till March 4th. So this was a negotiation tool. And the order from Mexico, we don't have to go through it because it's going to be almost identical. And what do we see as a result?
Well, what's funny, real quick, is that the Democrats were screaming about this because they see everything as static. They don't recognize there's more to it than what's on the surface. Oh my gosh, tariffs. There's no way they're going to agree to it. Therefore, inflation is going up. And my first response is, oh, wait a second. Before we make any decisions, let Trump talk to these people. One of the things I've learned, the art of the deal was not an accidental writing. The man knows how to negotiate, and he negotiates in the ways that we do as Americans normally. I mean, and I mentioned this with Ron yesterday. You know, you're trying to sell your car. You don't put the price down for what you expect. You go way high. They go way low. You work your way to the and Trump. That's how he's negotiating. He's doing that.
The results are great.
Mm-hmm.
Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico immediately sent 10,000 troops to our southern border, and Canada did something similar about shoring it up. Now, will this stop the flow of fentanyl, which is, and it's illegal aliens and fentanyl, but fentanyl is what he's really addressing as the national emergency. Well, both of them actually are the same. Will it be effective? Will it be 100% effective? No. But it's
nothing ever is, though. I mean, that's the reality. But will it stem the tide? Absolutely.
Also feeds into Trump's famous, strategy of using tariffs, or now he's talking about external revenue to fund the government. Well,
and understand, he's not using tariffs just as an economic tool; it's as a negotiation tool, and that's where his opposition is, because the problem is his opposition, they're appeasers, and they are institutionalized. Now, you've heard of people in prison so long they become institutionalized. These people in politics so long they become institutionalized, and it's all about the institution. All they know is the institution. All they know is the bureaucracy. This is the way it's done. This is the way we've always done it. Oh my gosh, he's going to upset the apple cart. Don't do that. I say grab the both handles and flip that sucker over. That's just me.
So we determined that these executive orders putting the tariffs in Canada and Mexico is effective.
And it is constitutional in the sense that he is executing a law in the books. There is a law in the books that gives him the authority to impose tariffs in an emergency or situation or national security situation. Whether or not Congress had the authority to give that to him, that's a different discussion. But from his point of view, it's totally constitutional because he's executing a law that's on the books.
One of the other impacts of the threatened tariff in Canada was some 60% of Canadian companies announced plans of moving their production to the United States. So although a tariff, which is a tax, is short-term inflationary because you're paying a higher price for goods, the amount of jobs it creates coming back, because the Americans are the biggest consumers in the world, it allows you to have this power. No other countries can really do this. We slapped a similar tariff on China, and China retaliated with some other areas as well. The end result with that, if we had a real trade war with China, is be some real supply chain shocks. But a lot of American companies would have to bring production elsewhere out of China, not necessarily back home. But so this is it's a dangerous game to be playing with the economy. But
well, yes and no. But I mean, and let me give you a little bit of insight that some people may not, for example, see. Where I live in Oregon, and you're familiar with this, is the logging industry is the primary industry. It's all about timber here. And what the previous regime, the Biden regime, was doing is they were actually going to make a deal to make it even cheaper for Canada to bring their lumber into this country. And there was fears about that agreement because it would essentially destroy the lumber industry in the United States. Canada then would be able to bring their lumber in for cheaper than what Americans were capable of. They wouldn't be able to compete. And Canada would have basically an unlimited supply of timber. So there would be no need for the American timber. And it would literally kill the American timber industry.
Yeah, wipe out towns all over the place. Same thing that happened in the textile industry way back when.
Absolutely. So by Trump saying, no, we're going to play fair here, tariffs, it's not going to be so easy for you guys. You're not taking advantage of us, so on and so forth. In the long run, it did things like save the American timber industry.
And timber, the industry is not about wiping out whole forests. It's done responsibly these days.
Yeah.
You cut down some trees and allow others to grow. It's
called selective cutting. I do that here. Every 3 trees, you go up to 3 trees. Which one's the best one? Mark that one. Go to the next 3. Which one's the best one? Mark that one. And then in most cases, they plant 2 for every one they cut down.
And it's good for that kind of process or cycle. It's good for preventing forest fires as well, because you're
because in order to get to those trees, to do the selective logging, and the way to get in is you got to get rid of the underbrush, and also get thinning out the forest.
The other thing needs to be mentioned is the United States lumber industry is at a competitive disadvantage from Canada already because of all the regulatory red tape they have to go through. Environmental laws are overly strict. Okay. Obviously, we did sovereign wealth fund already. And of course, the southern borders we just talked about. So here's one we can go over pretty quick. Career and Technical Education Month, 2025. I didn't even read this one yet. So what is he going to do here?
Well, it's a proclamation. What I'm doing is proclaiming.
Yep, I do hereby proclaim it's Career and Technical Education Month. So
but here's what's great about this. What it's doing is it's saying, hey, we're going to push things like trade school. We're going to push things that are about working America and fixing America and doing things mechanically for America. We're going to we're proclaiming a whole month to show that there are skill sets out there that you can achieve, good jobs that you can get without necessarily getting that, college degree.
Well, it addresses a lot of things. Of course, it reduces the need for the H-1B visa, which has become abused and so unpopular in many places. It also, there's two ways you can do to push, technology or education. One is to throw a bunch of money at it, which is what our government's always done. But I think the Trump's plan here is to get rid of some of the regulations and the barriers to entry in these different industries. And you're going to see a bigger...
And you do that, you see a flourishing free market. You see an economy that's boiling and bubbling at the seams and improving in the process.
And it's also naturally going to happen in the education system when you get rid of all the DEI stuff, because more time will be spent on the STEM courses. And that will automatically create a more skilled workforce in the STEM disciplines, which is a good thing. It's actually the main. Those are the disciplines that really education does a good job with if they're allowed to.
Now, and notice it's a proclamation. Proclamations are different from orders. A regular executive order, basically instructions to the executive branch on how to execute the laws of the country. Proclamation is an announcement that's not necessarily legally binding, and saying, hey, as a country, let's celebrate this or let's do this. It's an announcement.
Very similar to the next executive order, which is proclaiming American Heart Month. He's talking about, but even one soul lost to heart disease is a tragedy beyond comprehensive. To that end, my administration will work diligently to save lives, lower healthcare costs, etc. All this is doing is saying, February 2025, we're already in it, American Heart Month. And he's inviting Puerto Rico and other territories to join in. Nothing too exciting. Question, of course.
Once again, a proclamation, completely constitutional.
There you go. Okay, let's get our next one. Here we have imposing duties to address the flow of illicit drugs across our northern border.
That ties into the other one quite a bit, but
we've got the southern border.
But this one is imposing duties, which is a tax.
Exactly, and it worked. I'm going to get this one in the middle here because this is about the China, and there's some interesting things in here. Basically, to address the synthetic opioid supply chain in the People's Republic of China, which they could stop anytime they wanted. He's quoting the codes. He's quoting the International Emergency Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act. With all these executive orders, you find that, as he should, they're stating the congressional law that he is citing that gives him the authority.
Right.
This is the National Emergencies Act. We've talked about this quite a bit, but he has declared the opioid crisis a national emergency, which gives him extraordinary powers.
From a legislative point of view, it basically allows him to set aside any restrictions and do what he feels he needs to do. The constitutionality of the law is dubious, but as President of the United States, because the law's in place, he has every authority to execute it.
Perfectly said. And we've argued this quite a bit. I have about the danger of Emergency Powers Act. I think every state in the union ought to be taking a serious relook at their state Emergency Powers Act. We saw this during COVID, how the governors basically declared an emergency, whether it was or not, it's immaterial. They basically suspended all of our constitutional rights.
And we saw this in New Mexico, as you've pointed out a while back, with Albuquerque and basically gun confiscation under the idea of emergency powers.
Yeah, and it will be, if those powers are in place, it is inevitable that they will be abused.
Right.
If I can arbitrarily decide call anything an emergency, there is no limit to my governing power. None whatsoever.
That is one government guarantee that exists, is that there will always be those that will try to game the system, not only from the government but outside the government. There's always those who game it, and it's unfortunate, but that's part of the reason why the founding fathers didn't put asterisks in the Constitution that says, "Oh, by the way, if there's an emergency, you don't have to worry about this." They're not there.
But Doug, if it just saves one life.
How many lives in the long run are you killing in the process? That's beside the point.
There's some interesting details in this one. There's a lot of talk about where the opioids come from. Okay, so here's what they're doing here. I hereby determine an order as President of the United States is my highest duty is the defense of the country and its citizens. Not your highest duty is to protect the Constitution, but I will not stand by and allow this to continue. He previously issued a national emergency, Proclamation 10-10886. Notice it previously was a proclamation. I believe this is now an executive order. Or is it? He's expanding it here, and there's a couple of details in here. In doing so, I invoke my authority under Section 1702A1B of the IEEPA, that's Emergency Powers Act, and specifically find that action under authority to impose tariffs is inadequate to address this unusual and extraordinary threat. All articles that are products of the PRC, People's Republic of China, as defined in the Federal Register, shall be consistent with law, subject to an additional 10% ad valorem rate of duty. Such rate of duty shall apply with respect to goods entered for consumption or withdrawn from warehouse or consumption. The rates of this duty are above this order are in addition to any other duties, fees, extractions. Should the People's Republic of China retaliate against the United States in response, the president may increase or expand the scope. So we're talking about a trade war coming. Or they could just stop shipping opioid or, fentanyl. That would be my...
Parents, why do you set boundaries with your children? Just, right?
There's a couple other bits of language I wanted to see if I could find real quick. Yeah. We'll have to dig in that.
We have a society trying to tell you there are no boundaries, no limits. What you get from no boundaries, no limits is the mess we're in. And this president recognizes there's importance of boundaries and limits. And we're in a country that has the economic. See, it's interesting because you and I have talked in the past how the strength of the dollar is backed basically by the might of the U.S. military. Well, President Trump's actions are backed by the might of our economy. We have a stronger economy. You want to trade with us? Because we can afford to lose you as a trading partner, but can you afford to lose us? That's kind of the attitude. And that's the reason why Colombia caved and Mexico caved and Canada caved and China ultimately will cave.
Yeah, very much so. It's a bullying tactic, but it's deemed necessary. And, the rest of the world can resent it all they want. The United States, I have no problem. I don't necessarily want to be an isolationist, but the United States can completely sustain its economy without foreign trade. We don't want to go there, but, it's better. I don't want to get into what the last century, these people that call themselves free traders. Free trade is anything but. Free and fair trade is different. But all these free trade agreements are garbage. They're basically handouts to favored entities.
Right. Well, it's mercantilism on a governmental basis with other countries rather than businesses.
Yep. All right, let's jump back in. We have got a limiting lame duck collective bargaining agreements that improperly attempt to constrain the new president. What do you think he's referring to here? There's a specific target of this. He's citing a Supreme Court precedent that says a president cannot choose to bind his successors by diminishing their powers. It is hereby the policy of the executive branch that collective bargaining agreements executed in the 30 days prior to the inauguration of a new president and that purport to remain in effect despite the inauguration shall not be approved. Basically, Biden on the way out the door tried to throw a bunch of handcuffs on the Trump administration.
And this is just saying, no, don't work.
And I think that's the way it should be. A collective bargaining agreement is not a law. It is a contract signed between the administration and some other entity. Can the new administration withdraw from the contract? Well, sure.
Or negotiate a new contract.
Yep. I'd like to, I want to dig into the OMB, see how this is executed to see exactly which contracts he's talking about. Okay, moving on at a pretty good pace. Unleashing prosperity through deregulation. Boy, those are beautiful words.
Yeah, and understand the opposition. When they hear the word deregulation, they freak out. First of all, they take it to an extreme, and number two, they believe that if you deregulate, then that means that everybody will do whatever they want, whenever they want, because they want you. And first of all, regulations, deregulation does not mean getting rid of every regulation. A, B, deregulation is a good thing because you know what that allows? It allows the market to self-regulate. The market knows how to. When you have a free market, the self-regulation is not extreme, as you see with artificial regulation by government. And so when it comes to economic activity, instead of these big giant boom bust cycles, eventually you get this nice little ripple like the top of an ocean when it's not stormy weather. And that's, I think, what he's trying to unleash here. And when that happens, and then it encourages the creation of new business, the creation of new product, innovation, and in the long run, the big winners is everybody.
So here's the language here. Just about what Doug just said. It is a policy of my administration to significantly reduce the private expenditures required to comply with federal regulations to secure America's economic prosperity and national security and the highest possible quality of life for each citizen. Here's exactly what it's doing. To that end, it is important that for each new regulation issued, at least 10 prior regulations be identified for elimination. And that is a beautiful idea. This really ties into what we saw in the Supreme Court decisions last year with reducing the regulatory authority of different agencies. A lot of this is under the title of the Chevron deference. Mm-hmm. And just a quick reminder, Doug, what was the Chevron deference?
Well, what was happening is the regulatory agencies were basically given the opportunity to interpret the law as they pleased. And what wound up happening is the regulatory agencies were essentially creating law and modifying law to do so. And so the judicial opinion that came out of the case that ended the Chevron deference, which goes back to the 90s, basically said you can't do that anymore. You have to stick to what was in the intent of the law. If it needs to be interpreted, if it needs to be determined what was meant, it's up to Congress to tell you what it means, not for you to decide for yourself.
Yeah, Congress is the law-making body. The agencies, they call them rule-making entities, but they're not. That's the same as making law. But Congress was writing broad bills. The agencies would then write all the details. The agency then would police the policies that they put in place, and they would hand down the punishment. That basically made them the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, all in one for an unelected agency, which is basically the fourth branch of government known as the administrative state.
Yeah, that's so much for the separation of powers, right?
Exactly. Well, that's what the deep state is. It is these unelected bureaucrats, and these are the ones that are throwing fits at the USAID and other entities being defunded or even being audited. They don't want it. They've been able to operate without any kind of oversight and meaningful oversight whatsoever for decades. And that's coming to an end. So this is an excellent executive order.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely. And it is completely constitutional.
Yeah, and he cites the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 and the Administrative Procedure Act. So this one we can applaud. All right, here's a fun one. We're going to get into immediate assessment of aviation safety. Now, obviously, this comes on the heels of the tragic helicopter and plane crash over the Potomac last week. Basically, here we go. The Obama administration implemented biographical questionnaire to the FAA to shift hiring focus away from objective aptitude. DEI is what this is.
He's basically saying, hey, we went away from merit-based.
Now, never mind. Is the FAA constitutional in the first place, Doug?
Well, technically, no. This is a discussion I actually have in my classes often. When it comes to constitutional authorities, it has to be in the Constitution. There's nothing about aviation in the Constitution that gives the federal government authority over aviation. And then usually when I say something, I guess someone screams, yeah, but they've got to because, okay, well then let's pass an amendment and give them that authority if it's important that they have that authority. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm saying they don't.
Yeah, and there's a number of that applies to an awful lot of government agencies that have just been put into place without the required, amendment.
Well, and you get this attitude, well, gosh, Doug, they should. Well, just because they should doesn't mean that then they should just take it upon themselves. You don't want a government entity granting itself power. I don't care if they should. Still go through the process. Go through the process that requires the states to approve the addition of that power through ratification of an amendment.
But Doug, Trump's, basically interfering with our sacred institutions. I don't recall the sacred institution clause in the Constitution.
Yeah, sacred this, buddy. There's that's like saying there's a difference between fundamental rights and other rights. They're rights. The institution is either constitutional or it's not. You either have the right or you don't.
And it most certainly is not sacred.
Yeah, a lot of them. Well, a lot of them are sacred to tyrants, but maybe not to everybody else.
Okay. Additional measures to combat anti-Semitism. We know what this is all about. It's reaffirming Executive Order 13899 from Biden to advance the policy thereof in the wake of the Hamas terrorist attacks. A joint report by the House Committee on Education, the Workforce, blah, 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 Oversight and Accountability, Ways and Means calls for the federal government's failure to fight anti-Semitism and protect Jewish students astounding. This failure is unacceptable and ends today. This is really addressing the pro-Hamas campus protests.
And this really is a good and bad at the same time. It's good because I agree. The activities by certain people in this country against Jews, against Israel, so on and so forth, is disgusting. However, as much as I agree that that's disgusting, do we really want government taking aim at people's opinions and their what they protest about? I am not necessarily saying to let these protesters run freely and do whatever they want. If laws are broken, then go after them for those laws broken. If there is graffiti, if there's violence, go after them for that. But to target an opinion, anti-Semitism, as atrocious and egregious as that is, it's a very dangerous step for a government to be taking.
I agree with that. I think the way to handle this, of course, is to defund institutions, educational institutions particularly, that are not enforcing basically laws. When they are taking away a Jewish student's rights to go to class, what have you, that should be prosecuted by the law locally. It is not.
Why are these institutions even receiving federal money in the first place?
Well, that's another question altogether.
There's no constitutional authority for that. If the state wants to help fund these institutions, these educational institutions, that's up to that state. Private institutions, state funded, but for the federal government to get, because the problem with federal funding is the government, no matter what government it is, federal, state, whatever, government has this belief that, hey, if we gave you money, you're going to do as we tell you.
That's exactly right. And I think you're going to see some of that with Bobby Kennedy in at HHS. A lot of the science funding is going to be, let's have DOGE take a look at where that money's actually going. And what Doug just said is, if you are, let's say the government has a position that climate change is a dire threat. They are only going to give money to institutions that are going to come back with that conclusion. If you're one of the hundreds or even thousands of scientists who think that there's more questions to be asked, that science is not settled, you're not going to get that federal funding. That's, again, the government picking winners and losers in science. And that's not how science is supposed to work.
And then what happens is the science all comes to their consensus. We agree, even though it's not true. But wink, wink, nod, nod, we agree on this because we want our money.
It goes all the way through the peer review process and the scientific journals. And, of course, I did a show last year with Colonel Tanner Watkins where we talked about how Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, used to have a monopoly on the basically scientific journals. And he's done it since the 1950s. And science has been perverted for 6 or 7 decades now because it is not the free exchange of ideas. It is not science. The entire process has been ruined. And so hopefully DOGE takes a look at that. Is this constitutional? Well, you just addressed that. Okay. We've got a big one to close it on, so we'll get there in a second. Here he signs S5 into law, basically Senate Secretary of Homeland.
Riley Act.
Yeah, Lincoln Riley Act. Okay, well, of course that's constitutional. It's his job is to sign something into law.
Well, and not only that, but also that is regarding federal crimes by people who have violated federal law by immigrating into this country without going through proper immigration protocols. Very constitutional.
Yeah, and this is on the same note. Expanding migrant operations at Naval Station Guantanamo Bay to full capacity. He's basically expanding the beds at Gitmo. Interesting. And for dangerous illegal aliens. I don't know if these are for permanent prisoners or not. Interesting historical side note for those protesting this. In 1994, Bill Clinton had over 200,000 migrants housed at Gitmo. Yeah, that's right, 200,000. So what, about 10 times more than Trump's talking about right now at this point? Is this constitutional, Doug?
Absolutely. In fact, I've talked about this in my classes. Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Offenses against the law of nations would include violating our border laws by foreign persons. And so Congress has the authority to determine how to punish these people. In other words, using Gitmo as a punishment for foreigners, foreign persons who have committed crimes against us via the law of nations, international law, our borders, things like that, is absolutely constitutional. And the law that is on the books gives the president then the authority on who to send, when to send, all that. So not only is Gitmo constitutional, I'm hoping that from what I heard, from what I heard about Gitmo under the Trump administration is true. They're going to expand the facility.
That's the name of this executive order: expanding migrant operations with Gitmo. That has expansion.
Let's expand it, more beds, and here's the reason because. And I love this because the less argument has always been, you can't just deport people. Those countries won't take those people back. Well, thanks to tariffs, they are. And if there are some where they're not going to take them back or they're just so dangerous, we don't trust that country to hang on to them and not allow them to work their way back in our country, Now we got a place to put them. The old joke about, you take all the worst of the worst, stick them on some island somewhere. Yeah, that island is called Cuba. And we have Guantanamo Bay there.
There's another interesting part of that conversation. We heard Bukele, the president of El Salvador, saying, hey, you can send us a couple 100,000 of your unwanted.
I got a kick out. El Salvador has gone from communist revolution to, hey, man, we want to work with you, buddy. And El Salvador actually has been going through some great political movements over the last decade or two anyway, just like we've been seeing in Argentina.
They used to have one of the highest murder rates in the world. Now it's among the lowest in the Americas. So that part of it.
Yeah, because they started enforcing the law.
Yeah, but how they did it, here's where it gets interesting. Bukele in 2020 said that he's only temporarily going to suspend the Constitution, but the Salvadoran Constitution, he has not restored it in 3 or 4 years. Right. In fact, it's gotten to the point where his party nominated all the Supreme Court judges who turned around and changed their constitution. They reinterpreted the Constitution to make it so he could run consecutive terms. That's against their Constitution. There are a number of things that they are doing as part of this enforcement that are ultra-constitutional. That's why he had to suspend it. He seems to be a benign dictator, does a lot of things well, and it's been great so far for the people. However, as we always say with a slippery slope, what if the next person who succeeds him decides to abuse that power? So he needs to get their Constitution back in place pretty darn quickly.
King Harold might be good, but what if his nephew Joey, who's a real jerk, takes office later after he dies? Yeah,
and I think Ron and I did talked about this over a year ago on a show on his channel, and we call it the ethics of suspending the Constitution. It's up on my Rumble channel too, where we delve into this a bit. Their Constitution's fine; it's modeled after ours. There are checks and balances and limits. They're just ignoring them temporarily. And this is what he said there's a national emergency, and there was.
Yeah. And it sounds like to me, what it comes down to is the problem is not the Constitution, it's how it's being interpreted. And I say the same thing about the 14th Amendment. I hear all the time, well, Doug, we just need to get rid of the 14th Amendment because of this. 14th Amendment's fine. It's how it's being interpreted is the problem.
Now, what happens when Brazil's Supreme Court, which is not benign, decides they're just not going to have any more presidential elections? They start misinterpreting it. This is a problem. Yeah. A lot of slippery slopes on this stuff. Is it okay for the United States to be shipping, say, a Nigerian illegal alien to El Salvador?
You ship them wherever we want. Send them to the moon if we want. And hey, they want to take Americans too. These guys are hey, we got to make room for people, man.
All right. Next one is celebrating America's 250th birthday.
I am so excited about the fact, it's funny. Let me say this, and he has said the same thing. I have told people that when Biden got cheated into position, it was a blessing. Not only because Donald Trump got a chance to be on the inside, then the outside. Now he's coming in. But he has to be president for our 250th birthday and for the Olympics that he got here. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. We're old enough to remember 1976.
The bicentennial.
The bicentennial. Was that not a boom of patriotism or what? I can't wait until.
Those are some of my oldest memories. But I remember bicentennial quarters. Those are really cool.
I have a bunch of them.
And 1976 wasn't a great year for America besides that, but it really did a lot to boost our morale.
Well, and we started setting the stage for Reagan presidency in the near future.
Yeah, I criticize a lot of the policies that took place under Reagan, but as far as a cheerleader for America, he's about as good as they got. That's
and one of those policies was his flawed idea that you could actually negotiate with the Democrats.
The big thing about this is, I like this part right here, National Garden of American Heroes. It's an executive order he put in 2020, and Biden had one, and again 2 days before leaving office. Of course, they're going to be reinstated because Biden decided to overturn them. And what a National Garden of American Heroes is going to be, I do not have the details, but I sure like the sound of it. The other part about this is protecting America's monuments from vandalism.
Amen. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier with these protesters.
Yep, and he specifically mentions Lafayette Square, and they're going to restore a lot of these. What this does not do yet, I am not sure. Has he addressed Arlington Cemetery?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, that needs to be. That's something that needs to be on the to-do list. Okay, these last two executive orders have to do with education, and Doug's got some thoughts on that. So, and I pulled up the article of the one that is not in this, not on the White House yet. So we'll go over all three.
And understand while he's clicking all this stuff into place, two things. Number one, America became great with little red schoolhouses run by communities and paid for by the states. We started declining once we had a Department of Education, and we started nationalizing education efforts like in 1899 when Dewey took over. And B, Thomas Jefferson gave the model that was expected when it came to education. Federal government, none of your business. No funding, no influence. The states should fund public education, but the curriculum should be managed by those who are most directly involved, the parents.
Okay, let's get into these executive orders. First one is going to be ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling. Really good prelude to this. We don't have time to read every word of it.
So the purple-haired teachers that have the kids give their allegiance, pledge their allegiance to a rainbow flag is ending.
Yes. This is the DEI.
And yes, those people were out there doing that.
The definitions in the executive order defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government shall apply to this order. This is all of the DEI. That's his previous DEI.
Hey, and Democrats, trust the science. All right, go ahead.
All right. There's a little bit more to this than DEI. Talks about patriotic education, means the presentation of a history of America grounded in an accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling characteristic of America's founding and foundational principles. I got to do a criticism.
Hey, my history books are suddenly front and center on that one, right?
Yeah, the question is who's going to interpret what the accurate and honest, unifying, inspiring are.
Can I be involved in that?
Probably not. You know, the first thing Trump did when he got back to the Oval Office is put up the posters of Andrew Jackson, the pictures of Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. We're not going to relitigate whether Lincoln was a tyrant or not, because he was. And in my opinion, the worst president in the United States history. He's celebrated by many as the best because the victors write the history. And, you know, basically the people in government fund who write.
Don't always write the history, but the left does. In that case, they did.
Yep. He addresses social transition, gender identity, all that stuff. None of this stuff's going to be taught in school anymore. Ending indoctrination strategy. Just all through. It's just ending DEI in the schools, which is fantastic. My question, of course. Oh, he's also reestablishing his 1776 commission. That's interesting because that 1776 commission got a lot of things wrong. It's a better interpretation of history than, like, say, the 1619 project by a long shot, which was designed to address. I think a better idea than the 1776 commission is that everybody ought to go read the 1607 project, which was done by the Abbeville Institute. Talked about the founding of this, basically of Virginia and the real history of America.
And my history book.
We should do a show. Read Doug's book. We'll do a show on Doug's book. This 1776 commission is something we should go through and highlight some of the historical things they got wrong. I think that'd be a fun conversation. Good, well-intended, not the best execution. Brings the question, Doug, is this executive order constitutional?
Well, yes, because it's ending or it's beginning the process to eliminate the federal government's influences on education. Yeah, really, if we were to go completely constitutional, the Department of Education would be killed. There would be no need for executive orders on education. It would be left to the states. Ultimately, that's the ultimate constitutional action. However, we are in the situation we are. So it's sort of like, as they say, peeling back the layers of an onion. You start working to remove us slowly from the education. I believe that it is the goal of this administration to eventually eliminate the federal government's influence on public education.
And that'll be the next thing we hit, or the last thing we hit today. Bottom line is education should be done by state. It's a state issue. And
a community issue.
That's the way you want it. There's no one right way established to educate your children. And people are different. We've got different cultures around the country. But not only that, there's the idea that America is a great social experiment. And if you've got 50 different education systems, the ones that are most successful are going to be copied. That is the free marketplace of ideas.
Right.
That's not some top-down PhD idea from Harvard or Yale and some Ivy League. And that's what happened to our education. And
when the federal government is administering it, you don't have a choice. But when you have 50 different states, you have a choice because now you've got all these examples. The states operate just like businesses do in a free market. Oh, boy, what we're doing sucks, but they're real successful. Let's emulate that.
Yeah, the one-size-fits-all strategy to things like this do not work. And as we've pointed out ad nauseum, the government is just not good at anything besides killing people and taking our money. That's all.
Blowing things up.
Oh, that's killing people. Yeah. They're good at war. They're good at taxing. I can't think of another thing the federal government does better than the private sector. All right. This next executive order is one that a lot of people we know are celebrating, including us. And this is called the Expanding Educational Freedom and Opportunity for Families. Homeschool.
School choice.
Yes. Talking about K through 12, but too many children do not thrive in their assigned government-run K-12 schools. No kidding. They're failing. It also talks about geographical issues. So in this policy by administration to support parents in choosing and directing the upbringing and education of their children. Talks about educational choice. Within 60 days of this date of this order, the Secretary of Education shall issue guidance regarding how states can use federal formula funds to support K through 12 educational choice initiatives. A lot of these things are going to be put in place. The money should follow the student, whether he's in a public school, a private school, or a home
you're
school.
going to pay the money and taxes, but if you don't use public school, should you not be able to use that money for something else? That's what it's coming down to, number one. And number two, I spent a large number of years in the homeschool industry, I'd say 15 years, and mostly teaching government and Constitution, U.S. history, and economics. And the first response I get from people with alphabets after their name, but do you have credentials? The kids that come out of homeschooling from teachers and parents that are not credentialed are more prepared for continuing education than public school students. They score higher on tests than public school students. They win the spelling bee. I remember. I don't know. It's been the last half dozen years, but I remember one time I looked, and it was like 16 years. Consistently, the winner of the national spelling bee was a homeschooled student.
Yeah, big shocker there. And for those who don't know, Doug has taught homeschool American history for a number of years, and some good friends of ours opened up a pretty successful homeschool in Oceanside, California. And
yeah, they were so sad when I moved, man. They're like, no, we finally have a good, this awesome teacher, and you're leaving.
But you left your books behind.
Yes.
So, and Doug, as referenced a couple times, has written the U.S. history textbook for homeschool. Now, that's completed, or you're on like the third or fourth volume?
Part one is published. Part two and part three are part two is completed but not published yet. Part three is about 3/4 of the way being completed.
Doug, where can people find your homeschool textbooks?
Well, DouglasVGibbs.com is where you can find me. Due to my own inaction, the store's not up yet, but go to Amazon, look up Douglas V. Gibbs, books by Douglas V. Gibbs. I have that textbook. I have a government textbook called A Promise of American Freedom. The history textbook is called A Promise of Truth Self-Evident. That's kind of playing on some Declaration of Independence words. And then also I have a number of books on the U.S. Constitution, but the basic Constitution, the White Book, that's my first book on the Constitution, all of my handouts for my classes that I did. That's basically what that book is. I am working on a new textbook in the U.S. history textbook style. I'm done the outline. I haven't started on it because I need to get the textbooks for the history done on the Constitution. That's going to be based on the same type of style. So I'm excited about that. And I do have I'm serious because my first love is science fiction. I have actually published a science fiction book, so called Damon's Folly. Just came out.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Okay. This one, I don't know if the executive order has been written yet, but Doug brought it up and we need to talk about it. So I pulled up an article and we'll go through that and close out. Okay. In Trump's quest to close the education department, Congress and his own agenda may get in the way.
I have that article. I've read that article. Oh, I'm excited now. We're right in my wheelhouse here.
Oh, read it for us, Doug.
All right. Well, let me make the screen bigger so I can see this. All right. So rather than read it, let me say what it basically says. President Trump is looking to slash spending regarding the education department. Can he do that? Absolutely. Power of impoundment, presidential power of impoundment. He is in preparing an executive order, which will basically start slashing that. Recognize that there's only so much he can do. The department, however, cannot be eliminated by executive order. He can slash the budget. He can remove funding. He can do through Linda McMahon. It's funny because Linda McMahon's job is to get rid of her own job. I love it. But he can do everything he can to want to get rid of the Department of Education. But in the end, it still requires congressional action. Congress uses legislation to create executive departments, and they must use legislation to eliminate executive departments. But basically, this is, along with those other ones we've talked about, is the beginning of that process. But once again, the power of impoundment allows the president to decide how the funding is going to be put out and if he wants to slash funding for a particular department. He can do that.
I love this line in here. It says, I want Linda to put herself out of a job. He's referring to his Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon.
Linda McMahon, when she was named, I have to admit, I was kind of stunned, but yet not. People, do you know who Linda McMahon is? She's the wife of, Vince McMahon, WWE. By the way, very conservative and gets it. She absolutely does.
So there's a little bit of history to the Department of Education I'm going to go over that kind of backs up what Doug just said about how it was founded, and Department of Education was founded, and basically how it would be ended. 1867, there's something called the Office of Education was created within the Department of the Interior. Mm-hmm. This is basically implementing Horace Mann's education system he learned by going over in Prussia. The Prussian education system was basically about obedience to the state and not questioning authority. That started getting implemented in America in the 1860s.
Hegelism.
So that's 1867. Of course, right on the right at the end of the Civil War, when we're basically trying to
and understand real quick. Mann was basing his system on Prussia, who was basing theirs on the teachings of Friedrich Hegel. Friedrich Hegel was the guy who Karl Marx studied. Just saying.
Yeah, trust the experts, respect authority.
Yeah. But now that got shot down as being unconstitutional.
Yeah, in 1868, they downgraded to the Bureau of Education, and it still stayed under the Department of the Interior until 1939.
And public opinion was very upset about the creation of that department because they didn't want the government interfering with the education of their children.
Bingo. So in 1939, the Bureau transfers to the Federal Security Agency. With the reorganization of the federal government in 1953, the Bureau is then moved to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
We're just trying to take care of you, don't you know?
1958, they passed the National Defense Education Act, which was spurred, interestingly, by the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik.
Yeah, well, don't forget about Dewey taking over in 1899 with his progressive education system during the progressive era.
Yeah, absolutely. Both Dewey and Mann are considered the both. If you Google "father of American education," it'll pull up one or the other. Sometimes both. Interesting thing about Sputnik, which is basically the Soviet Union launching the Sputnik satellite, it led to a massive amount of spending in science and technology in America, and that's how we were able to, beat them to the moon, allegedly. I always have to put the allegedly because I know some of our followers do not think we ever landed on the moon, and I actually don't know. I wasn't there.
Well, I remember watching it on TV. Oh, but Doug, you can't believe everything. This is true. But I've actually gone through a lot of this stuff on the possibilities and discounted a lot of those things. But yeah, I hate the fact we have to say allegedly. You know how we fix that allegedly?
Go back.
We go again.
All right. The other thing Sputnik did is it started the launch of what I mentioned earlier, when Robert Maxwell started scientific journals and peer-reviewed science, peer-reviewed in air quotes. That's when our science started to get bastardized. It's right there. Civil rights movement, we saw the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. So now you're getting the civil rights, all of these progressive ideas are getting into all of our schools. And then finally in 1979, Carter he made a campaign promise and he signed, he creates the Department of Education into law in 1979.
And what's been going on in our education system since 1979?
It's been going straight downhill.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's pretty much.
So that's something else that you said there was two things that federal government was good at, which was taxing and war. No, there's three things they're good at, and taking anything and sending it into a downward death spiral.
Anything they touch eventually gets corrupted. It is what it is. When the founding fathers knew that, they did not want a big centralized government. So we're up to speed on those executive orders. I'm sure Trump's going to keep us busy. Maybe that'll be next week's topic as well. Depends if it comes down the pipeline. If that's not our topic, next week we're going to start getting into the Confederate Constitution, and that's a series. Our good friend Ron Partain will be joining us. That's a series you're not going to want to miss. I'm going to start. We'll start with a little bit about the real origins of the Civil War because it matters and it's evident in the Confederate Constitution. Thing to remember is these guys had 80 years of observing what went right and what went wrong with the U.S. Constitution. So this, as far as the document goes, doesn't matter how you feel about the war, as far as the document goes, is a governing contract. It's got a lot to look at, and it's going to take us a few weeks to get through it, and all of us are looking forward to that.
And might I add here at the end, I'm finally, I think, ready to fire up my video making machine. So be on the lookout, rumble.com/Douglas V. Gibbs or youtube.com/Douglas V. Gibbs. I did one video a few weeks ago on bitterness. It was basically from a monologue I did on my radio program. And we're going to start going through the Constitution bit by bit, but not the way I did in my classes. This is something totally new, way I'm going to do it. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity. So be on the lookout.
Doug, thanks as always. See you next week, if not sooner. And
all right.
Everybody, thanks for watching. Cheers. We'll see you soon.